beautiful Shabbat afternoon to you, everybody. Grace and peace be upon you, and welcome to this week's study from the book of Matthew. We are now in chapter 26. This week, we're going to look at the plot against Yeshua. And I want to preface this teaching this week by saying that it is going to be a lengthy discussion. The chapter that we're going to be going through today has 75 verses, and there are a lot of things that we're going to be discussing today, and we just have to get through chapter 26. We have 2 more weeks before we bring the book of Matthew to a close, maybe 3. So we're going to try and work our way through these 75 verses today. With that said, let us get right into this week's discussion. Let's begin with reading from verse 1 through to 16. It says, "When Yeshua had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, 'As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified.' Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Yeshua secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. While Yeshua was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. 'Why this waste?' they asked. 'This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor.' Aware of this, Yeshua said to them, 'Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured the perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.' Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, 'What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?' So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over." So let's discuss these couple of verses. The last time we met, when we were in chapter 25, we saw where Yeshua gave a number of parables, and he said the kingdom of heaven is like the 10 virgins. 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. Then he gave the parable of the bags of gold, and then the parable of the sheep and the goats. It tells us in verse 1 of chapter 26 that when Yeshua had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "The Son of Man is going to be handed over to be crucified." Matthew highlights here that Yeshua said to his disciples that the Passover is 2 days away. It's important for us to note that the Passover is 2 days away because Matthew wants his audience to know that everything that's going to happen in chapter 26 is happening during this period, 2 days before the actual Passover Seder. Now, for those of you who have been celebrating Passover and who know what the Torah says, it does in fact bring the story of Yeshua's crucifixion to life. Because we know that the Passover lamb was slaughtered on Nisan 14th in the afternoon at about 3 o'clock, but it wasn't eaten until the 15th of Nisan, which began at nightfall. And this is also the first day of unleavened bread, the first day of the feast of unleavened bread. So let me say that again. The Passover lamb was slaughtered on Nisan 14th in the afternoon, but it was not eaten until nightfall, which is when the 15th of Nisan would begin. This tells us that Yeshua is talking to his disciples 2 days before Passover. So it is saying that Yeshua was having this conversation with his disciples on the 12th of Nisan, 2 days before Passover. As we get into this discussion, it will become clearer to you as to why the timestamp is important. But let's move to verse 3. It tells us that the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Yeshua secretly and kill him. Now, right off the bat, we see that what the religious order was about to do to Yeshua was illegal. It was illegal because the people, the chief priests and the elders, assembled in the palace of the high priest. Why not the Sanhedrin? Why not the court, the official courthouse of the people of Israel? Because what they were about to do was illegal. It was halakhically illegal. And so the people, the leaders, assembled in Caiaphas's palace. When we get further into this discussion, I'm going to break down the trial for you and all of the illegal things that the religious order did in the trial. These people are scheming to kill him, but they didn't even realize that it was in killing him that his mission would have been accomplished, that they were actually working to fulfill God's master plan. Now, from verse 6 through to 13, it tells us of Yeshua going to Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, and a woman who in Matthew's account is nameless comes up to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, and she anoints him. And Yeshua told his disciples that she was doing a good thing for him, even though some of them were upset about it because they thought that the perfume could have been sold and the money given to the poor. Yeshua said what she's doing is she's doing a good thing. She's preparing me for burial. Now, in the account in John, we find that John actually names this woman. John says that this was Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Now, when we get down to verse 14, it tells us that one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Right here, we also see another part of the illegal trial of Yeshua. Because Jewish law says that an individual cannot be tried or even arrested based on bribery. We know that the Torah says it in Exodus 23:8, where God said, "You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just." So the religious order's acceptance of Judas's offer to betray Yeshua, and also their payment of 30 pieces of silver to betray him, that constituted a bribe and delegitimized Yeshua's trial. Let's move on to the next slide. So remember, Yeshua began speaking to his disciples 2 days before Passover. And so verse 17 begins with, "On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yeshua and asked, 'Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?' He replied, 'Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house.' So the disciples did as Yeshua had directed them and prepared the Passover. When evening came, Yeshua was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" Yeshua replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi?" Yeshua answered, "You have said so." While they were eating, Yeshua took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now until that day, when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Before we begin discussing these couple of verses, my prayer is that the Ruach HaKodesh will remove every veil from our eyes so that we'll be able to see what he is teaching us today. And my prayer is that teaching will be easy and learning will be easy, because what we're about to do is to take a deep dive into scripture. And when it comes on to talking about dates, especially round about Passover, I believe that there is the tendency for people to become confused. And the truth is that this has always been like that. And as I get deeper into this discussion, you will realize that it's not something that's new. It has always been like that from the very beginning, right? But my prayer is that the Ruach HaKodesh will give us the understanding and the insight that we need as we go through these couple of verses. Now, what I'm about to share with you should be a little easier for us to grasp because we have background knowledge of the Torah. However, there are lots of believers in Messiah out there who don't understand this fully because they don't understand the Torah. But even when we understand the Torah, sometimes it can get a little overwhelming. So let us just ask the Ruach to guide us, okay? So in verse 17, Matthew said it was on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. When the disciples came to Yeshua and asked, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" This is the first challenge we are going to have to work through, because we already know that the first day of the festival of unleavened bread is a rest day. It's a Sabbath. Because in Leviticus chapter 23, it tells us that on the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, we're not to do any regular work. So it could not be on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread that the disciples were coming to Yeshua to say, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Because they couldn't be making preparations for the Passover to be eaten at that time. So we have to understand this, that the first day of the festival of unleavened bread here in Matthew's account is really in reference to the 14th of Nisan in the day, right? When preparations would be made for the Passover. So this is in fact preparation day. Why the disciples would have gone to him and said to him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Because no preparations could have been made on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. Matthew's audience, however, would have understood the intricacies of that. So they would have understood it in a different way from how the West would understand it, right? Because they would have understood that the first day of the festival of unleavened bread would have been a high Sabbath. But it gets deeper, and we will get there in just a little while. Now, from verse 18, it tells us that he gave instructions for them to go to a certain man in the city and tell the man that the teacher wants to have Passover with his disciples at his house. It says, so the disciples did as Yeshua had directed them and prepared the Passover. They prepared the Passover. Matthew says, when evening came, Yeshua was reclining at the table with the 12. And Yeshua took bread and he blessed it and he said, this is representative of my body. Then he took the cup and he blessed it and he gave them to drink. And he says, this represents the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. He tells them that this is the last time that he's going to be eating and drinking with them until when he eats and drinks with them in the Father's kingdom. And then in verse 30, it tells us that they sung a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, everything that we're reading here, right, speaks to a Passover Seder. Yeshua said, we're going to have a Passover Seder. And we see the food, we see the unleavened bread, and we see the wine, and we see the singing of Hallel, right? And then they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, all of this looks pretty straightforward to us. We are looking at the Passover Seder here. However, it's not so clear-cut. Because when we look at other accounts in the Gospels, we're going to see that there are discrepancies. And today we're going to look at some of those discrepancies, and we're going to see what could have led to them and how we are to understand this meal that Yeshua had with his disciples before his crucifixion. Was it a proper Passover Seder that is had at nightfall on Nisan 15th when the festival of unleavened bread begins? Or was it another meal? Because there are some scholars who say that the Last Supper is different from a Seder, right? So these are some of the things that we're going to be discussing. I did say that we're going to take a deep dive into the word today to understand what happened. So with that said, we're going to take a look at the Gospels, and we're going to take a look at how this night is documented for us. So for the next couple of slides, we're going to look at the synoptics versus the book of John. What are the synoptics? The word synoptic means same. We're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These books are coming from the same source. Now, scholars believe that Mark was the first one to be written around 70 CE or AD, while Matthew was probably composed in the late 70s or 80s, and Luke in the late 80s. So this is why they're called synoptics, because they're coming from the same source. John's account of Yeshua's life and ministry, however, is a standalone book. John does not use this source text of Mark in writing his gospel. And so how John presents is actually very different from how we see Matthew, Mark, and Luke presenting. We also have to keep in mind that these three writers were targeting different audiences. We already know that Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. It is believed that Mark was written for a Roman audience, while Luke was written for a broader Gentile audience. So how the gospel of Yeshua's life and ministry is presented in these books or by these writers is done in a way that is targeting their audience, even though what is written is coming from the same source script, from the same manuscript, right? John, on the other hand, is writing a universal gospel for everybody. But his approach to writing about Yeshua's life and ministry is different from the other three. The other three were focused on the physical aspect of Yeshua's life and ministry. John's writing is very spiritual. As a matter of fact, John's writing was all about the spiritual aspect of Yeshua's life and ministry. Yes, he's telling about all the things that happen and so on, but he wants his audience to see Yeshua as not just any human being. He wanted his audience to see Yeshua as the one who existed from the very beginning. And this is why John 1:1 begins this way. In the beginning, he's going all the way back to Genesis. He wants his audience to know that this Yeshua who walked the earth was the same Yeshua that was there, Breshit, in the beginning, from Genesis 1:1. So he begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So John wanted people to know the Yeshua that was beyond human, just a mere mortal man, but Yeshua who existed with God from the very beginning. So with that said, let's look at what we find written in the synoptics concerning the festival of unleavened bread. In Matthew 26:17, it says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yeshua and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? In Mark 14:12, it says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, Mark says, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Yeshua's disciples came to him and asked, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? Mark goes into a little bit more detail about this first day of the festival of unleavened bread. He says, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb. So this is the 14th of Nisan. This would be preparation day. Let's look at what Luke says. Luke says, then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Yeshua sent Peter and John, saying, go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. So here we see the synoptics pretty much talking about the day of unleavened bread, but we see where Mark and Luke go into a little bit more detail and said, this is the day when preparations would be made to eat the Passover lamb. So we know that this is in fact preparation day, which would be the 14th of Nisan. It says here the Synoptic Gospels tells us that Yeshua and his disciples actually had a Passover Seder on the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 15th of Nisan. And so if we were to take how this is written in the synoptics, that Yeshua had a Passover Seder on the first day of unleavened bread, when it is customary for the Seder to be eaten, it would mean that the next morning would be a Yom Tov or a high Sabbath. Now that's going to create some issues, because there are lots of things that we see happening that could not have happened on a high Sabbath. So for example, would the religious order be crucifying a man on the Yom Tov? No, they could not. Would the religious order be holding a trial on that day, on the Yom Tov? No, they would not. And we know that even though they took Yeshua to Caiaphas' house, as a high priest on a Yom Tov, he would be very busy. He would not be able to be holding a trial on that day. Judas would not be able to be purchasing supplies on the Yom Tov either, because John 13:29 says this. It says, since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Yeshua was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. So Judas left the meal and went out. It was night, but the disciples didn't pay any attention to it, because they figured that maybe he went to buy something for the festival. Now, Judas would not be able to buy anything for the festival if the meal that they were eating was actually on Nisan 15th, because that would have been a high Sabbath. He would not find anybody selling anything, and he would not be able to buy anything. There is no commercial activity on a high Sabbath. It also tells us in John 18:28 that they took Yeshua from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning, and they did not enter the headquarters themselves. Otherwise, they would be defiled and unable to eat the Passover. So we know that Yeshua's trial and his crucifixion actually took place before the Passover festival began. Now let's compare John's account of what happened. In chapter 13, verse 1 to 2, it tells us that it was just before the Passover festival. This reminds me of what is written in Matthew 26, where Yeshua said to his disciples, "It's 2 days before the Passover festival." John said it was just before the Passover festival, so John's account seemed to be connected to what Yeshua said. What is happening, according to John, is happening within this 2-day period, but it really is happening before the Passover festival proper. That would actually begin on Nisan 15. So it seems to me that what is happening here, according to John, is happening over this 2-day period that we read about in the beginning of Matthew 26. So let's continue reading. It was just before the Passover festival, and Yeshua knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Yeshua. Which evening meal? Are we to understand that John is talking here about the Seder on the 15th, or is there another evening meal that he is referring to here? Remember all the things we discussed in the previous slide. If this was the Passover Seder on the 15th, it would mean that Yeshua would have been arrested on a Yom Tov, tried on a Yom Tov, crucified on a Yom Tov. And we know that that could not happen, because a Yom Tov is a day when the people would be busy holding a sacred assembly, and Caiaphas as high priest would be very busy on that day. So clearly, John is speaking of a time before the 15th of Nisan. Let's look at John 18:28 to 29. It says, Then the Jewish leaders took Yeshua and Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, What charges are you bringing against this man? So here we see that Yeshua is on trial, and he is taken to the Roman governor's palace. But the religious order would not enter the Gentile palace because they would become ceremonially unclean and be unable to eat from the Passover that was going to be taking place at nightfall on the 15th. So Yeshua's trial actually took place before Passover began. So let's go down now to John 19:13. It says, When Pilate heard this, he brought Yeshua out and sat down on the judge's seat at the palace, known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. So we see Yeshua being tried by Pilate, and it was a day of preparation, and it was about noon. Now let's go to John 19:31. It says, Now it was a day of preparation, and the next day was a special Sabbath, meaning that it was a high holy Sabbath. And the religious leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. So we see here that on this preparation day, they did not want the bodies on the crosses. And so Pilate was asked to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Now let's look at verse 41 to 42. It says, At the place where Yeshua was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had ever been laid, because it was a Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Yeshua there. So it is telling us that Yeshua died on preparation day, which would have been the 14th of Nisan. So how are we to understand this? If Yeshua died on the 14th of Nisan, on preparation day, on the day when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered, it would mean, therefore, that Yeshua's trial actually began on the evening of the 13th of Nisan. And it would also mean that this meal that Yeshua had with his disciples was on the 13th of Nisan at sunset, which would facilitate him being tried in the wee hours of the morning, sentenced to death on the 14th of Nisan, and being buried on the 14th of Nisan on preparation day. So here we have the conundrum. Was the meal that Yeshua had on the evening of the 13th of Nisan a Seder? Because the Torah says a Seder must be had on the 15th of Nisan. So why is it that Yeshua and his disciples would be having a Seder on the 13th? Because that's the only way that Yeshua would have been tried and sentenced to death on preparation day, the 14th of Nisan. Before we get into that, I'd like to share with you something that is written in the Babylonian Talmud that tells us when Yeshua was crucified. Yeshua is actually documented in the Talmud. So let's take a look at that. The Talmud is a collection of writings that covers the full gamut of Jewish law and tradition, compiled and edited between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Written in a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, it records the teachings and discussions of great academies of the Holy Land and Babylonia. We actually have 2 Talmud. We have the Talmud of Jerusalem and the Talmud of Babylon. So, in the Babylonian Talmud, there is a commentary on Yeshua's death. And there are other things that's written in the Talmud about Yeshua, because as I have shared with you before, the Jews don't deny Yeshua's historicity. Everybody knows that he was a real man living in the Holy Land during a period of time, and that he was a prophet. Some people say that he was not a prophet. He was an apostate and he practiced sorcery and all kinds of things. But anyway, the Talmud records something for us in Tractate Sanhedrin 43a. It says this: Yeshua, that's not a typo. He's not called Yeshua. He is called Yeshu, and I'll soon tell you why. Yeshua was hanged on Passover Eve. 40 days previously, the herald had cried, "He's being led out for stoning because he has practiced sorcery and led Israel astray and enticed them into apostasy. Whosoever has anything to say in his defense, let him come and declare it." So they actually made that announcement that Yeshua was going to be put to death because he practiced sorcery and was leading Israel astray. And remember, in the Torah, it says that if anyone practiced sorcery, they were to be put to death. And so the story that was made up about him was that he was guilty of practicing sorcery and leading Israel astray and enticing them into apostasy. It says here, as nothing was brought forward in his defense, he was hanged on Passover Eve. So this is what we find written in the Talmud, a body of Jewish law written by some of the great scholars and academies of Israel and Babylon. Now, let's talk about why he's called Yeshu and not Yeshua. Now, we know that Yeshua means salvation, and I find it very interesting because salvation is all over Jewish prayers and all over the Torah. So even today in the prayers, we see Yeshua mentioned. Salvation is his name, right? But Yeshu is actually a word play. It's a word play on his correct name, Yeshua or Yehoshua, the extended form of his name. But Yeshu is actually a play on his correct name, where they use an acronym. Now, the acronym that is used is Yimach Shmo Vizikro, and this acronym, Yeshu, Yimach Shmo Vizikro, means may his name and his memory be blotted out. When someone dies, in Jewish tradition, it is said, may his name be a blessing. But they call him Yeshu, which means may his name and memory be blotted out. But you and I know that Yeshua's name and memory will never be blotted out. Never. So that's what's written in the Babylonian Talmud. Yeshua was hanged on Passover Eve, on the day before Passover, or the day before the feast began. So again, we're left with the question, what about the meal? Was it a Passover meal or it was not a Passover meal? Was it a Passover meal or was it a Lord's Supper, Last Supper, as it is taught in Christianity. So in order to understand the last meal that Yeshua had, we're going to take a look at the writings of Rabbi Lichtenstein. He was a 19th century Hebrew commentator on the Gospels. And he proposes that where other scholars see a discrepancy or discrepancies between the Synoptic Gospels and John's Gospel, he proposes that there is room for harmonization which retains both the Synoptic version and the Johannine version, or the version of John. According to him, there was a debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees about when Passover should fall that year. Pretty much like the debate when it comes on to the counting of the Omer. I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but there is this huge debate about when we really should count the Omer. Should the Omer be counted on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Nisan, or should the Omer be counted on the Sunday after the weekly Shabbat on the week that the Passover falls? And that debate has been ongoing. It existed from the Second Temple period. And even today, there are people who will say that we begin counting the Omer on the Sunday after the Sabbath. And then there are some who will continue the tradition of counting the Omer on the 16th, the second day of Passover. So, there were always these debates between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. It's not unheard of. And so Rabbi Lichtenstein was saying that this year there was this huge debate about when the Passover should be held. Now, according to him, whenever there were debates like these, the Sadducees would lose the debate. We all know that the Pharisees were the popular group, right? And whenever the Sadducees won any kind of debate, apparently the people would revolt. And so the Pharisees had the upper hand because, the Pharisees were known for the traditions and they were known as the experts in the law and so on and so forth. And so a lot of times the Pharisees would literally force the Sadducees to comply with the Pharisaic traditions. You and I know that these two groups did not see eye to eye, except when they had one common enemy in the person of Yeshua. So according to the rabbi, in those days, the Sanhedrin, and we know that the Pharisees ruled the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees ruled the temple. In those days, the Sanhedrin determined the new moon and the beginning of the month by observation. So, for example, different people in different parts of the Holy Land would have to come forward, 2 or 3 or more witnesses would have to come forward and say, we saw the new moon last night, or we saw the new moon whenever. And so when this happened, the shofar was sounded and the new month was announced. Like how we do it on Shabbat Mevarachim, where we announce the upcoming Rosh Chodesh. When the new moon was observed, the word would get back to the Sanhedrin, who would sound the shofar and declare that the month of Nisan has begun. All right, so this is how it will be done. Now, Rabbi Lichtenstein posits that in the year that Yeshua died, the Pharisees hired false witnesses to declare the new moon had been seen. And this stalled the month by 1 day, so this extra day gave them the opportunity to plot Yeshua's death. So there were lots of things happening round about this time on the Hebrew calendar that meets the eye. Rabbi Lichtenstein was saying that in addition to the debate, the usual Pharisaic Sadduceic debate as to when the new moon really begins, there was also something else at play, and it had to do with the fact that the Pharisees used bribery to change the date by a day. I wonder if you get what I'm saying here. And Rabbi Lichtenstein's position has been corroborated by both the Talmud and also Rashi. Rashi says that year the date of Passover was changed. And so, according to this rabbi's belief or his opinion, he says that because of this change of the date and so on, and of course the ongoing debate about, which day and so on and so forth, Yeshua knew that he would not be able to have the Seder with his disciples at nightfall on Nisan 15th when it would have usually occurred. But he took advantage of the fact that some Pharisees were keeping the Passover a day early according to their own reckoning of the month. So with this debate between Pharisees and Sadducees about when the Passover was really supposed to happen and so on and so forth, there were actually 2 days of Passover, which I am sure sounds very familiar to you, because you and I know that even today, there are 2 Seders. There are 2 Seders that take place. There is one Seder that takes place on the 15th, and there's another Seder that takes place on the 16th. In Yeshua's time, however, the 2 Seders took place, one on the evening of the 14th and one on the evening of the 15th. According to Lichtenstein, because Yeshua knew that he would not be able to keep the Seder with his disciples at nightfall on Nisan 15th, he took advantage of the fact that some of the Pharisees and also some of the people of Israel were keeping a Passover a day early. And so, what we find is that the meal that Yeshua had with his disciples was in fact a Seder. It was a Seder. It was just an early Seder, unlike the Seder of the 15th, when the Torah says that the real Seder is to take place, if you will, then, right? So it was a Seder. It was just not the Seder on the 15th. Because on the 15th of Nisan, when everybody else was having their Seder meal, Yeshua would have already been crucified on the 14th in the afternoon. And so Lichtenstein's position is that there is really no discrepancy with the Gospels. He says the Gospels reflect the idea of 2 days of Passover. The synoptics were going with one view, and John was going with another view. John was going with the majority, while the synoptics went with the minority. John went with the position that Yeshua went with. Let's move on. We're going to read now from verse 31 through to 35 of Matthew chapter 26. And then Yeshua told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly I tell you," Yeshua answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. Now, here we see where Yeshua said that what was going to happen to him was in an effort to fulfill what was written in Zechariah 13:7, where it says, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And this is exactly what was going to happen, because once Yeshua was arrested, it tells us that once he was arrested, the disciples ran. The disciples ran except for Peter, and there was another disciple who was with Peter in Caiaphas's courtyard, but he was not one of the 12. But all the others ran except for Peter. And Yeshua said to Peter, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. I've shared with you before the importance of the number 3 in Jewish law. It means complete, legal. So when Peter denied Yeshua 3 times, he was concretizing the fact that he didn't know Yeshua. It was significant that he said this 3 times, which, by the way, when we get to Yeshua's conversation with Peter, he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? If you love me, feed my sheep. 3 times. Why? To override his denial, he had to say that he loved Yeshua and would feed his sheep 3 times in order to override what was legally binding. But I also want to ask you this. Verse 34 says, Yeshua said, before the night is out, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Who or what is this rooster that Yeshua is talking about? Stay tuned. We will talk about that in just a little while. Verse 36 to 46. Then Yeshua went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, may your will be done. Then he came back. He again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So this place called Gethsemane is called in English oil press. So Yeshua is about to be pressed. And so he is in this place called Gethsemane. And he goes there with his disciples to pray. And the scriptures tell us that he took Peter, James, and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, along with him, his inner circle. And he became sorrowful and troubled. This part of Yeshua's story reveals to us his humanness. You know, just like any of us who knew that we were about to go through a horrific experience would be sorrowful and troubled. Yeshua was sorrowful and troubled. He wasn't just going through a horrific experience. He was going to die, right? And so it tells us that he was heavy. His heart was heavy. And the one of the accounts tell us that it was so bad that his sweat became like drops of blood. And that is something that science has proven, that if someone is under extreme stress, it can begin to rupture the small blood vessels, and that person can begin to sweat blood if the right circumstance presents itself. And this is what Yeshua was experiencing at that time. He was deeply sorrowful and troubled. And so he took his inner circle because he needed the support. And he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Now, you and I have spoken already about what happens on the night of Passover. After Passover, it's supposed to be a night when Israel would keep watch. After the Seder, it's a night when Israel would keep watch. Israel was supposed to stay up all night and pray and keep watch and thank God for the deliverance. This is what the Torah teaches us. So, even though this is happening before we get to the 15th of Nisan, there is still another aspect of the Passover here that we see happening. There is a night of watching also that's happening right here. Now let's go to verse 39. It tells us, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed. And he asked God, if it is possible, may this cup of wrath be taken away from me, because we know that the scriptures tell us that it pleased the Father to crush him and to put the sin of humanity upon him. And he said, if it is possible, let the cup of wrath be taken from me. Then he says something amazing. He says, yet not as I will, but as you will. He was broken, but he said, God, Father, it's not my will, it's your will. Wow. Verse 40 says, he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. And he said, couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? And then he said to Peter, you need to watch and pray too, so you don't fall into temptation, because you're going to be tempted to deny me. So you need to keep watch and pray. And also remember that you are the one who I've given the keys to the kingdom. You are the leader that I'm leaving in charge. So you should be staying up to keep watch. It tells us that he went away a second time and prayed, and he said, Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, your will be done. And the third time, he went and he prayed the same thing. When we get over to the book of John, John's account tells us that Yeshua prayed at different times, 3 different times for different things. Protection of the disciples and all of those things. You can go and read that account over in the book of John. Well, I want to draw your attention to something that we find in verse 43 though. It says, when he came back, he found the disciples sleeping because their eyes were heavy. In the Greek, the word here, heavy, it is not just talking about one's eyes that's heavy, or you're drowsy, or you just want to sleep. The word here in the Greek means depressed. So when a person is depressed, they're prone to sleep a lot. And so the disciples' eyes were heavy with depression, just as Yeshua's soul was overwhelmed with sorrow. They were too overwhelmed with sorrow also, to the point where it caused them to fall asleep, like their bodies just could not hold up. Their bodies couldn't hold up under the weight of the events that were about to take place. And even Yeshua said it too. He said the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. His flesh was weak. Their flesh was weak. Everybody was just weak because they knew what time it was. They knew what was about to happen. And when we just started to look at chapter 26, it also tells us that at the dinner, the disciples were very sad. It tells us that there. So even though they were all together and they were eating, and it tells us that they sang Hallel afterwards and so on, it was really a sad and heavy night for everyone. And Yeshua said, God, if it's possible, take this cup away from me. And then he said, not my will, but your will be done. And at the end of it, he said, rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Verse 47 to 56, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man, arrest him. Going at once to Yeshua, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Yeshua replied, do what you came for, friend. Then the men stepped forward, seized Yeshua, and arrested him. With that, one of Yeshua's companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Put your sword back in its place, Yeshua said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? In that hour, Yeshua said to the crowd, am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place, that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Now, let's talk about this. It tells us that Judas came with a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, and he kissed Yeshua. And the men stepped forward and seized and arrested him. And Matthew says one of Yeshua's companions drew a sword. John tells us who the companion was. It was Peter. And he cut off Malchus' right ear. And Yeshua told him, put back his sword. Yeshua told him that he doesn't have to fight for him. He says, do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he would at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Two things came to me as I read this. One, even Yeshua called on the Father, asking him to send angels to help. So people who believe that they have the power to command angels, Yeshua said, I can call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels. The hierarchy is that we petition God to send help. Let's talk about the 12 legions of angels. What's a legion? A legion is the largest, or should I say was the largest unit in the Roman army, with 4,200 infantry and 300 cavalry. Well, I can ask my Father, and he will send more than 12 legions of angels to help me. You know how many angels that is? Yeshua says, you don't have to fight for me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. So it has to happen in this way. Then we see in verse 56, a very sad verse. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. In fulfillment of what the prophet Zechariah had written in chapter 13, verse 7, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Let's read from verse 57 to 68. It says, those who had arrested Yeshua took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Yeshua so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Yeshua, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Yeshua remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said so, Yeshua replied. But I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you? So it tells us in verse 57 that those who arrested Yeshua took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. So everybody is waiting for Yeshua at Caiaphas's house, which, like I said to you a couple of slides earlier, that this was the beginning of an illegitimate trial. Why was he taken to Caiaphas's house? If he's being tried and justice is being meted out for some kind of crime or wrongdoing, why is he at Caiaphas's house? He's at Caiaphas's house because they can't take him to the Sanhedrin where trials are done. Because, one, people are getting ready for Passover and they don't want to create a scene and they don't want people to begin to ask questions and they don't want a riot. And also they're looking for some kind of ism and schism and whatever else so that they can try him secretly, condemn him secretly and kill him secretly. So they take him to Caiaphas's house, which you look at it and you say, but the high priest, isn't he supposed to be upholding the values of Torah with justice and equality and fairness for all? Oh no. They're all of them have come together and they are carrying out this masquerade of a trial because they must find something to put him to death on. In this slide, we're going to look at some of the things that made Caiaphas's trial of Yeshua a quote-unquote kangaroo court. So, first thing on the list here, the Sanhedrin could not try a capital case outside of their regular meeting place on the Temple Mount. Yet here, the judges assembled in a private house. That's enough to throw out a case, right? Because it wasn't tried in the proper place. And it's a capital case. The next point, capital cases had to be tried by daylight. Jewish law says that. You cannot try a case in the night. They arrested Yeshua at night and tried him at night. Caiaphas and his court convened and adjourned before dawn. Number 3, no trials could be held on Sabbaths or holy days or on the eve of a festival or a Sabbath. Jewish law said that. Neither did the Sanhedrin conduct trials during the entire month of Nisan. That's why it had to be kept at Caiaphas's palace. In this case, Caiaphas and his court conducted the trial on the eve of Passover and the eve of the Sabbath during the month of Nisan. In a capital case, the court did not declare a guilty verdict on the same day as the trial. The court of Caiaphas came to a verdict in less than an hour. In a capital case, when the testimony of witnesses proves false, the judges nullify it and punish the witnesses. The court of Caiaphas ignored that the false witnesses were revealed by cross-examination. As a matter of fact, also remember that even though men came forward and said, we heard that he said that he can tear down the temple and build it again in 3 days, that's not what they used to convict him. They used his own words when he said, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the Father's right hand in heaven, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And then they said, blasphemy, this is worthy of death. So the false witnesses that came forward and so on and so forth, they did not even pay those people any attention, because it was a kangaroo court. It says here, in capital cases, the court appointed a defense attorney to defend the accused. Yeshua had none. The accused is not allowed to incriminate himself. Caiaphas made Yeshua's own words the basis for the verdict. Before standing trial, the offender should have been verbally warned by 2 witnesses that the deed he was about to commit was a crime. In a capital case, senior judges vote last to avoid influencing the court. Caiaphas voted first. In a capital case, a unanimous guilty vote must be declared a mistrial. In the court of Caiaphas, they all consented to the verdict. So, the last couple of verses, and then we're going to bring this teaching to a close. It says from verse 69 to 75, now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were with Yeshua of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow was with Yeshua of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Yeshua had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Here we see Yeshua's words coming to pass as he had spoken concerning Peter. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. So who is the rooster who crowed? Was it a rooster, or it was another type of rooster? So first, we have to understand that it was not halakhically legal, like by Jewish law, for roosters, or chicken for that matter, to be raised in Jerusalem because of fear of contamination. So chickens were not raised in Jerusalem or close to the temple area, right? So the rooster here was not a literal rooster. The rooster here was actually a person. Now, the Hebrew word for rooster or cock is gaver, and it can also be used to mean man. It's the Hebrew word that means man also. So the rooster here is actually a man. It's not a chicken. It's a man. And this man is a man that was in charge of the temple, to open the temple early in the morning and to call out that it's time for prayer. Remember, Yeshua went through the trial all night. So dawn is breaking. And at the first sign of dawn is when there is the early morning prayers. And the rooster here is the man who had the responsibility to open up the temple and to call out, dawn has broken and it's time for prayer, or whatever else he said. And this call is known as a crow. It's the crowing of the rooster. So Yeshua saying to Peter, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Before the man calls out, dawn has broken and the temple is open for prayer, you would have disowned me 3 times. The scriptures tell us that he went outside and he wept bitterly. I want to thank you so much for having joined us for our study through the book of Matthew today. I know it was a long study, and maybe you might have to come back and listen to this teaching again at your own pace. But I pray that clarity has come to you on some questions that you might have had. And I look forward to any questions you may have or your feedback, if any, on our discussion today. Again, thank you so much for having joined us. May you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon and a wonderful week ahead. Shalom, shalom, and kol tov.